Thank you all for joining us for this month's Second Thursday lecture, brought to you by the Friends of the Cabildo and the Louisiana State Museum. My name's Katie Trevino, and I am the Curator of Education here at the Louisiana State Museum. And today's lecture is on Remembering the Cajun Past, Memory, Race, and the Politics of Public History in Louisiana by Marc David. A Louisiana native, Marc David received a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution and has held positions at the University of Oklahoma and St. Olaf College, where he currently teaches. Remembering the Cajun Past is his first book, the fruit of 2 decades of ethnographic fieldwork and archival research. Before we get started on the lecture portion, we're going to go do a little housekeeping. During the lecture, please stay muted. And if you have any questions throughout, you can go ahead and type that in the chat box. And at the end, we'll get to them. Marc will also have little spots throughout where he'll ask questions. So if you have any questions there, feel free to ask at that moment. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it over to Marc.
Excellent. I just want to start by, well, greetings. Bonsoir, monde. Thank you so much, Katie and Louisiana State Museums, for inviting me to do this. I'm really excited to have the book out in the world and be talking to people about it and engaging about it and hearing what people make of it. So it's great to start that here with y'all down in New Orleans and across the country. I probably need to maybe I'll start sharing my screen here. I probably need to apologize in advance, first of all, for this is going to be a little rough around the edges because it's the first time that I try to condense the book this way. Um, and it's also going to be cursory. There's going to be moments where I'm just going to kind of state things flatly, and they'll probably need some unpacking. But I'll be concise and supply more information during question and answer if need be. Um, and as Katie just mentioned, I'm going to divide this into 3 parts. It's basically kind of 3 big pieces of the book. Um, yeah, I'll try to get through all 3 of them. If we don't have time, I'll do at least 2, and see where we are, and if there's enough time, I'll go ahead and do the third one as well. Can everyone see my PowerPoint here? Is it coming through okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, so this is here's how my grandmothers would have reacted to news of this book. Um, I'll assume that you're bringing something like the same question that they would have had. What the hell is this about? I well, there's a lot in the book, and I'm certainly not going to talk about everything tonight, but I am going to try to elaborate on these 3 things in a kind of an overview of the book's main arguments, right? So this is a book about how, first of all, contemporary Cajuns acquired memories of their forgotten past. It's also a book about how shifting public narratives about Cajuns' history helped to whiten them, and that happened at Black's expense. And then finally, it's a book about how the new Acadian public history expands a politics of shaping citizens through engagement with historical truth. And I'll kind of unpack that last one when we get to it. So I'm just as you can see here on the screen, I'm specifying this is not a history per se or a book about Cajuns per se, but it's more of a story about recent public history of Cajuns in Louisiana. So quickly, a few other things about the book. It's part ethnography, and which essentially for our purposes means just that it's based on interviews and observation, and it's part history. There's a lot of archival research behind this. It's focused on St. Martinville, which is for those of you who don't know, is a town, kind of a large town, a parish seat town in the southern part of the state. And I interviewed somewhere around 200 residents, visitors, and professionals there and across Louisiana and even beyond. And it's also focused on, in particular, as you'll see, the Acadian Memorial Museum in St. Martinville, which I situate relative to a kind of a 10 site complex of venues that are devoted to Cajun history, that almost all of which have emerged since the mid 1970s. So here's here's how I want to focus my talk. Like I said, something of an overview about how the book answers its big questions on its the three main topics that are mentioned in the subtitle: on memory, on race, and on public history and its politics. So I'll start with the first topic of memory and uh, basically articulate the big question that I'm asking about memory. So if in a nutshell, if there's no popular memory, no popular or folk memory of the remote Acadian past, for example, Le Grand Dérangement, which um, uh, when the British expulsed the Acadians from colonial Nova Scotia, right? If there's no memory of that, how do locals connect to these histories as their own? What do they make of them? Because in so many words, these sites are presenting Acadian history to locals as their history. Like, do they make anything of the history that they encounter in these sites? And I can connect this to a, let's call it a broad anthropological question that we can ask about um, human behavior in general. How do people come to remember a distant past that they've completely forgotten? Right. So the answer to this has two pieces, which I'll walk through here now. The first piece comes from findings that I got from interviews I did with locals, residents of St. Martinville, about um, their sense of what it's like to live in St. Martinville, and during which I'm paying close attention to the discrete memories that they're sharing as they talk about their experience. And then finally, in these interviews, I'm paying close attention to whether or not they connected those memories to an identity of being Cajun. And I'll just mention in passing, we can talk about this later, but there were plenty of people in St. Martinville who could identify as Cajun, but who didn't. So um, here's one of the biggest findings that emerged from all those interviews, right? Those folks, those residents of St. Martinville who did identify as Cajuns, often link that label to memories of their social marginalization, derision, hardship, or discrimination. And um, there's just there's tons of examples of this. I'm going to have to, for given the constraints of time, I'll limit myself to just one. Um, but they came in different varieties. Sometimes there were memories of kind of from childhood or early adulthood. Other times it was examples kind of a more recent experience. This one is one of those. It's more recent. And I'm talking to a woman who I'll call Andrea Sabache, and that's a pseudonym. And she's remembering this recent encounter with the Mr. Rabelais, who basically says to her, "Oh, you're Acadian, you're Cajun, you're descended from that riffraff that they took out of the prisons in France and brought to Louisiana." And she's like so offended by this. She's like, "Oh no, that's not me. That's not us, right?" It was John Law who's a kind of a early colonist in Louisiana, who brings these other French people to Louisiana, but not the Acadians. And you can see here, she's like, he made me furious. The Acadians did not come from the jails, right? These attitudes, it really got me, she says, right? So, what I want to stress about this is, and like I said, this is an example, and I could give you many more. The antagonists in memories like this, like Mr. Rabelais here, often asserted some sort of essential defectiveness about the self, the person who was remembering, in this case, Sabache, right? A defectiveness that was transgenerational and inherited. The label of Cajun came with this charged indictment that somehow, congenitally, permanently, Cajuns are flawed social beings, right? And to be clear, right, and that comes through in this example I just gave you, this was an indictment that these folks wanted to contest and challenge. They did not accept it, right? So the second piece of this answer is to the question of how did folks come to remember the Acadian past as their own, comes from findings in visitor reception interviews that I did at the Acadian Memorial, right? So another 50 or 60 people whom I interviewed who were visiting in different settings, whom I interviewed at the memorial. So I'll mention here in passing that just to describe the memorial briefly, it's kind of a hybrid space. It's combines both commemoration and historical exposition. So it's got a commemorative part that includes a mural painting and bronze plaques that list all of the Acadian colonists who immigrated to Louisiana in the 18th century. And it's also got an historical exhibit that traces the history of Cajuns from late medieval France all the way up to the present. And then the other thing to mention about this, and this will be important for the kind of the latter part of the my presentation, the site was heavily promoted as conveying historical truths about Acadians. Um, and it was inaugurated after an existing public narrative about their past was discredited. And that's there's a whole kind of piece of Evangeline history. If anyone knows St. Martinville, you know that it was the Evangeline history that predominated there before this new site was inaugurated. All right. So how did the Cajun past become memorable to these locals? Right. Through my interviews, I identified that there are kind of three paths into remembering the Cajun past that visitors developed, that they generated through their engagement with the site. One was through genealogy, another was by analogy, and a third was via autobiographical remembrance. And again, I don't have time to go through all of these, so I'm just going to focus on one. And I've picked here one of the most amazing statements that I heard in all of, and in general, these visitor reception interviews were just kind of so rich and intriguing. Um, and so here's an example of an elderly Cajun man, Morgan Richard, who here's an example of how people came to remember the Cajun past through their own autobiographical recollections. And this is just uh, it's really striking. I kind of want to read most, if not all of it. So he says, to me, when I come in here, it's kind of like it's just kind of a solid place to me. It's something you can reflect back on and think what misery those people, and he points to the mural, went through. I mean, of course, that Pop, Arthur, Cindy, my son and daughter, we did this. We had no electricity when we were growing up as kids and no toilets or anything. And then he affects his child's voice. Y'all didn't have that? Oh no, just couscous and cornbread. Or if we wouldn't have been, if it wouldn't have been for that, we'd have starved to death over there too. And the sweet potatoes we grew. I mean, things were really backwards and all. So I guess as I get older, I'm coming into my twilight years. I've just celebrated 82 years old, and I get to appreciate this more than ever. We're proud that these people, and he gestures to the mural, did all this and could really leave something to the children. And I just find this the most remarkable thing. I call it an auto history, right? He's kind of combining autobiography and history in this statement, and there's no editing here. It's that was all said in one moment, right? And so he's what I find fascinating here is he's interweaving his own memories tightly into the site's narrative about their, now his Akkadian ancestors, right? It's this amazing. In that statement, he's toggling back and forth, talking about them and then himself and then them again, right? And kind of like really tightly meshing, right, the personal story with the history in a sort of unified narrative that signifies his continuity and identity with the ancestors, right? So that's why I'm saying there's something of a memory of the deep historical past that's emerging from his engagement with the memorial, right? So here's the answer to my first question. If there's no popular memory of the remote Akkadian past, how do locals connect those histories to their own? Do they? Yes, they absolutely did, right? Through this makeshift crafting of a sense of history out of their experience near recollections, like the one that Morgan Richard made, and in dialogue and active engagement with the site itself, right? And not least, and um, this is something that really came through. People were constantly drawing on those, I call them memory tattoos, those searing memories of some sort of derision or marginalization, right? And they were using those memories as fodder to connect with the site's narrative. All right, how are we doing? So far, so good. Any questions or comments?
I think we're good.
Yeah, keep going.
Yep, I think so.
Okay. All right. The next topic that I'll cover here is the topic of race in public history. And um, so here's this is really this is the thing that really kind of first got me interested in writing the book, right? I have a strong sense that there was a real sharp about face starting in the 70s, right? A kind of a before and after, where Cajuns into the 70s had been so vilified and castigated by authorities who problematized them as this severe blockage to the state's modernization and progress, and identified kind of the core of the problem as Cajuns being trapped in a traumatic history that they could not shed, they could not let go of, right? So, how do we go from that? And those were the dominant public historical narratives about Cajuns prior to the 1970s. How did we go from that to Cajuns becoming the happy, what I call the happy minority, right? Which is something, there's a discourse and a history about them as a kind of a model white ethnic group, right? Whose joie de vivre and integration of tradition and modernity are kind of celebrated as something exemplary, something that not just the region, but really the whole country needs to know about, right? How did that happen? And so I want to say that this is also a question about race, right? Because before the 70s, I would say, and this is a certain way of putting it, Cajuns were cast as being not quite white, right? There was something really problematic that made other whites want to distance themselves from Cajuns, right, in South Louisiana. So how did they go from being not quite white to the fuller inclusion into whiteness that exists today? So I know if you're from South Louisiana, you know the story. For example, it's widely discussed and commented on, right? How uh, Cajuns' attachment to French, to the French language, to speaking French, was seen as a huge problem, right? That essentially French was eradicated through the public education system, especially across mid-century, right? But the one thing, and I spend the whole first chapter on this, the one thing that I found in kind of working through the archives and just kind of popular literature from earlier in the century, last century. Um, Really, it's everywhere you look that Cajuns are seen as being a serious problem, right? And so this quote that you see on the screen now is from a couple of economists who are basically talking about how uh, you know Cajuns are so attached to their folkways. They're so unwilling to adopt efficient modern farming practices that we really need to kind of push them out of agriculture. We really need to get them into manufacturing and service jobs where that attachment to the folkways and that inefficiency is not gonna weigh down the economy, right? And I could go on and on. Social workers, educators, of course, just all kinds of people, rural sociologists. They're just finding all kinds of problems with Cajuns, right? Um, and here's a couple of rural sociologists who are speculating on, like, what's the problem here? What's the core of the problem with Cajuns, right? And their past, for lots of observers and experts like Smith and Parrington here, their past was the heart of the problem, right? And here they're basically saying that the experience of um, the Grand Dérangement, of their expulsion from Nova Scotia by the British, was so traumatizing that it's forced them, it's led them to cling to their past, right? And that's why they won't modernize with the rest of white Louisiana. They're stuck in the past in this kind of fixed, unchanging way, and that this whole problem was also racialized in a certain way. As I said at the top here, Cajuns were not quite white. And essentially what I'm saying here is that as you read across these documents, it's really striking, right? There's whites, experts, authorities are constantly making a distinction between the rest of white Louisiana, to mainstream whites, middle class whites, and Cajuns, right? And um, this is kind of this statement, and this Homer Borst was a social worker, and this kind of represents like one end of the spectrum of this kind of sentiment, this kind of anxious sentiment about Cajuns. And basically, here he's saying that there are so many Cajuns living so close to black folks that we're not really sure if they're going to stay on the path into whiteness or veer off of it, in so many words, right? Um, but the main gist here is that main whites who saw themselves as being in the mainstream could not accept Cajuns as fully one of them, right? And that's just everywhere in in the literature. So in the realm of public history, I I postulated that something had to happen, something had to emerge that would actively counter all of those negative narratives, right? Something had to create enough force to negate and replace them with a different story. And so yeah, I'm asking the book and trying to answer the question, what exactly happened? So here's the new in a nutshell, here's the new historical narrative that emerges, I would say, both kind of in public historical sites, but also kind of more broadly speaking in public discourse, right? The past of Cajuns began to be cast as a history of what I call the happy minority, right? So and this really starts to take shape in the late 60s and early 70s, amidst all the social turmoil, um, where the story gets shaped that Cajuns are something of an exemplary minority group, right? They are able to combine tradition and modernity in a really constructive way, right? Which a lot of folks were thinking, like, all these ethnic groups are not doing that, right? They're kind of destructive, right? And in fact, the contrast, there was often an explicit contrast with black folks in this regard, right? The other piece is that folks are constantly pointing to Cajun's joie de vivre, right? Alongside their unwillingness to indulge in a politics of grievance, right? And that is what they see as a model for how they promote and advance and talk up as a model for how minority groups should act, right? And so, um, yeah, just to kind of like summarize the core of the story, Cajun's upbeat endurance of the discrimination and oppression that they had endured, starting with that expulsion, with the Grand Dérangement in Nova Scotia as the definitive instance of the kind of victimhood that they had endured, right? This became central in histories about them. All right. How did this narrative emerge? What forces fostered and crafted it? So I discuss some of the usual suspects. If you, I draw on people like Shane Bernard and his book, The Cajuns. If you're familiar with that, I'm using some of the stuff that he talks about there. Um, Cajun Power, which I see kind of in distinct sort of way. I mean, it's got multiple dimensions to it, multiple threads. It's a movement for language and cultural preservation, and obviously there I'm talking about, for example, Codafil, Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, and those programs. It's a movement for um, Cajun ethnic pride, right? And it's also, I would say, a movement that's about trying to achieve upward mobility and inclusion, right? But there's also some other not so commonly mentioned projects, efforts that I discuss in the book, and that's the electoral politics after the Voting Rights Act in Louisiana. That plays a role in the emergence of this narrative. There are also several developments in the field of public history proper, and that's both locally and through federal institutions like the Smithsonian and the National Park Service, right? And I'll talk maybe a little bit about one of those in a minute. Um, so, what's the racial angle on this? I would say that one underappreciated aspect of Cajun Power as a social movement is that it was a campaign for material success, social respect, and whiteness. And I'll unpack that a little bit. So here's an image in this slide. You see an image of Edwin Edwards, who very famously ran a strong kind of ethnic regional campaign in his first effort to become governor back in 1971. Right. Um, Interestingly, right after his victory, he's interviewed in the New York Times and he's asked, "What's the significance of your victory for all these Cajuns that you represent?" And he said that the main thing was that they appreciated, "I've proved that a Cajun is as good as anybody else," right? I would connect that to things like many of you may know about the famous kind of discrimination lawsuit that was brought by Calvin Roach when he sued his employers. It was an oil company, and he had coworkers who were slurring Cajuns as coonasses, right? And everyone will know that that term from South Louisiana. Um, and he heard it. It was used, in the workplace, and he brings suit seeking to protect what the company considers inferior second class citizens, right? And in both of these comments, I just want to point to, you know, what you see here, I think, is that Cajuns really wanted to be included as acceptable participants in white spheres of politics, business, and civil society, right? And now I want to connect it here. Here's another really interesting quote that connects it um, to historical narratives and to the Acadian Memorial itself. So here's a consultant to the memorial. When I asked him, "What's the well, for you? What's the site's intended message? What's the bottom line here?" And he says, very interestingly, he said that it showed that Cajuns had triumphed twice over the English and les Américains, who both tried to destroy their culture. And he said that the memorials served as this kind of inclusive intervention, which generated an awareness that Cajuns had escaped a stigmatized society and now belonged to the mainstream. They were either eager to tell others triumphantly, here we are. And I interpret this, I find this really interesting, right? These dynamics that he is describing, it's Cajuns struggling for recognition and respect within whiteness, right? He's referring explicitly to other groups of whites and how the memorial and its history are commanding respect from them. And I'll just, um, yeah, I'll just say this in passing. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. But the new Acadian history, here's the interracial dimension to which I mentioned at the top, right? It centered the deportation's violence as the defining event in the Cajun past, while the cruelty of slavery and Jim Crow could not be represented to any significant degree in the public sphere in South Louisiana, right? So that's where there's both an intraracial aspect to what I'm talking about in terms of race and an interracial one. So, how did Cajuns go from being cast as not quite white to their fuller inclusion as whites today? In part, it was by advancing this history that celebrated the Cajun past as the overcoming of obstacles and suffering that helped to secure this fuller inclusion as acceptable and normal white folk. All right. We still good? Any questions, comments?
Not yet. I think we're good.
All right. All right, Sha. I'm going to keep going. All right. So, third and final keyword, public history and its politics. So, um, here's the big question I'm trying to answer. Why have so many individuals and organizations developed so many venues? There's nine since the mid 70s. There's nine venues in South Louisiana, including three alone inside of the National Park Service's Jean Lafitte Park. Right, nine venues. Why so many venues devoted to Cajun history? What kind of citizens are we supposed to become by learning the truth about the Cajun past? Um, I, More broadly, that question relates to this one. What is it about historical truths that is so essential to citizenship in a democracy? We have so much history, and it's often supported by, if not public funds, then nonprofits who are promoting public history as a very important common good, right? And if it's supposed to do something for us as citizens, consuming, engaging with so much history, how do sites achieve their intended effects on us, right? In fact, do they have any impact on us, right? Now, so I want to just take a minute to specify how I'm using the word politics here. I'm using it in a specific way. I'm not talking only about electoral politics or public policy, though that's part of what I'm discussing in the book, right? And I know that when we hear politics and the related word power, um, we often think like relations of domination or coercion, right? Um, but I'm using it here in a particular sense that references its broadest meaning of relations of power between individuals and groups, right? So this is more expansive than talking about it in terms of like coercion. By this definition, relations of power also involve attempts to influence or persuade or even teach. And so, by this definition, the realm of public history is saturated with relations of power. All right. Now, here are some things that I noticed in as kind of goals of practitioners um, who were involved in either the memorial itself or in promoting the expansion of the public history of Cajuns um, across the state, right? So here's a set of quotes by folks who are promoters or designers or sponsors in some way of the memorial itself. Um, these are really striking to me. When descendants of Acadians visit it, the memorial, they will experience something special. People say they feel like they're looking in a mirror. Now that people are able to stand in front of the painting and think about the exiles who came here, it will deepen the feeling about our culture. It will be a reserved, quiet setting so that people can remember all things close to their heart, who they are, and where they've come from. I, I, I find this really striking. If I didn't know any better, I would think that maybe they're referring to some sort of, I don't know, transformative liminal experience that people are having, right? But I think if you read documents closely, plans, white papers, which I did for the project, this is actually pretty common that that designers, curators of historic sites, not always, but often, and the memorial certainly falls in this category, they are seeking to transport visitors from ordinary conditions of perception and learning into extraordinary ones, like the ones that they're outlining in these statements, right? Here's another um, piece of goal of public history that I bring into the book, which has a kind of a this is broader. Um, um, is is connected to a fellow named Freeman Tilden who worked for the National Park Service starting in the 60s and who was the 50s rather, and who was something of a theorist of their approach, of their vision of what public history is for, right? And he wrote this really amazing piece for the bicentennial in 76 in which he says that really history is about guiding citizens through an engagement with historical truths, right? He says from history we learn who and what we are as individuals and as a nation, right? In all the national park systems historical sites, the thinking visitor is revealed to himself. He asks himself, the questions: what would I have done under these circumstances? How would I have measured up to need and opportunity? Questions like that, finding oneself, answering the question, who am I? Um, that's just to linger on this for a minute. That's an amazing kind of expansive sense of that basically sees that um, history, public history, historic sites are about guiding citizens into a fuller understanding of what it means to be self-governing and problem solving as democratic citizens, right? We're supposed to like get something, learn something, reflect deeply on profound truths and apply them to our own lives, right? And that's not something that we normally think of, but Freeman Tilden was a hugely influential kind of theorist practitioner. He was profoundly he was hugely influential in the Park Service, and you can see his influence. For example, I see it in the John Lafitte sites in Louisiana, right? So this is a really strong current vision of what public history is for that also shapes uh, um, this new Acadian history in Louisiana. And then finally, one thing I'll mention is this. Um, Starting in the 70s and 80s, um, practitioners in the region in South Louisiana begin to say we need to spread historical truths in order to work on reforming citizens' behaviors in some way, right? There's a way that we can use history to um, reshape how people are social relations in the region, right? And here's an example. This is from Glenn Conrad. Some of you may know um, Conrad. He was the director of the Center for Louisiana Studies for a long time, decades, I think. And he wrote this in the early '90s, where he basically says, um, "Yeah, there's a problem in South Louisiana. Cajuns believe these flawed memories of their grandmas about how they're mistreated and land was taken away from them by Anglos and les Américains, right? And he basically said that's false, um, and we need to do something about this, right? He's like, you know, these Cajun riders didn't sufficiently penetrate the fog of ethnic or racial pride to understand exactly, what happened to their people, right? He goes on to say in just after this excerpt, he basically says, Cajuns, because of this, they're they're kind of arrogant. They think more in terms of us versus them instead of we, like all of us in South Louisiana. I was really surprised when I came across this, but he put this in writing. It's really sharp, and he basically says um, we have to spread a truthful history in order to begin to correct people like these Cajuns, right, who are a little bit gotten too big for their britches, right? We need to generate and diffuse an accurate history to bring them down a notch. All right, so home stretch here. Um, these three parts, these projects, these visions for public history to engage visitors immersively and interactively, to stoke reflection on history's truths and their application to citizens' lives, to use historical truths to shape social relations in the region. All of those, and this is kind of the one of the biggest findings in the book, all of them came to align with the motivations and projects of individual Cajuns who rolled into uh, and visited the memorial itself. And this is another thing, as I said, some of the richest and most engaging interviews I did throughout the entire project were these these histories with these interviews with folks who visited the memorial. Um, and one of the things that came through was that they very much felt like history was a tool for them to gain personal authenticity and truth because history at the memorial was being presented as bedrock, as truth that was sound enough to guide your life, as Freeman Tilden proposed, right? Visitors use the memorial's narrative to pursue their own efforts at self fashioning, to achieve a stronger sense of dignity and pride and authenticity. And again, I could go on and give you multiple examples here, but I'll just focus on one from a woman named Cindy Arsenault, who I think served as the chair of the memorial's nonprofit board for a while. And here is what she said about the main message of the site. Our nation of people is pretty powerful. We fought what was happening, which was a noble scheme of genocide. Wow, it's pretty powerful. And we have something to be proud of now. And we are. There's lots of pride. And I'm pretty proud of what I've been able to do, as minute as it is. It's a part of me, she continued, right? When I asked her about kind of like what does it mean for her personally, she said, the site, the history is a part of me and it grows deeper and stronger. I have something special that's easy being the historian of and being able to garner people's love for what I love, namely the 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 story of the Cajun past, right? And so what I found, and there, like I said, many more examples of this kind of amazing, transformational, even engagement with the site. Um, the way I would put it and summarize it is that history became something of a tool, as I said, for gaining personal authenticity and truth. It facilitated an integration of historical truth that was out there with subjective truths in here, right? They interpreted the truths presented by the site as saying something profound, vital, and authentic about themselves. All right. So what? Why have why have I wasted the last 45 minutes talking to you about this? Um, here's how I would put it. This is kind of summarizes this last piece and is maybe kind of the biggest thing that I try to say in the book. Both in the objectives of practitioners, right? Those different visions of what public history is for, and in the motivations of visitors, I contend that public history is intended to and sometimes does transform our subjectivity. It makes us into new kinds of persons. That's what the example of Cindy Arsenault is meant to illustrate, right? It's intentional, and it's so that means that public history is intentionally about more than knowledge acquisition, right? We don't usually think of it that way. We often consider history to be, didactic. It's information. It's stuff we need to know, right? But what I found in the memorial that it goes way beyond that, right? On both the practitioner side and the visitor side, right? It's really people want to change citizens on the one side, and they want to like work on themselves on the other, and all of that I would say is very political. All right.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Because I can't hear you.
Have I gone out now?
I can hear
Um,
you.
I can hear you as well.
yeah, I
Katie,
can
I
hear you.
just don't think we can, I think you might be having some audio issues,
Let's
but
see.
Test mic
You
test.
can hear me. Okay, I just can't hear everyone else. Okay, great. Um,
Okay. All right.
we do have a question. I'm gonna ask, and while you answer, I'll try to fix this on my end. Um, First one is how much of the subjugation of the Cajuns in the mid 19th century stemmed from economic factors versus racial or cultural perception?
So I would say so. I'll talk about the 20th century, which if you get the book and read it, you'll
can you
see
hear
the
him?
the,
I
the
can hear you,
first
but I can't hear myself. I can't hear
the
myself
first
on the thing.
the first chapter is about the first half of the 20th century, right? And um, the economy is definitely in the mix, right? Like as the quote from those two economists suggested, right? Like Cajuns cannot get with the program and modernize, right? They can't adopt, can't adopt modern farming practices, and that's an issue. We need efficient farmers, and Cajuns are not efficient, right? Um, but I think that some of the same thing was being said, for example, in the sphere of home economics, right? Like cases weren't eating right, and so we needed home extension agents to go out and teach them how to eat well, right? Um, there's some suggestion that like during World War II, there was like there was there's there I summarized some documents in that chapter where people are like, it's not clear that Cajuns can be good soldiers, that we can draft them, right? I know that kind of runs counter to to the narrative. There's a new book out about the Frenchies, right? These Cajuns who served in as soldiers in World War II, went to France and right spoke French, communicated. Um, but I guess what I would say is the economics is in the mix, but it's broadly speaking like across the public sector, across public life in every dimension, right? Cajuns are not being good citizens, right? There's even like you read this there's a kind of a strain in the discourse that they're antisocial, right? They're insular. They don't really reach out to people, right? They're not eager to become part of American society, right? So it wasn't just economics. It's participation in social and public life across the spectrum that was a problem.
Okay, great. I am listening to you via cell phone of someone else, so I can hear what you're saying. Um, so our next question is, can you say more about what the Cajuns did to affect their agricultural security, as mentioned earlier? Someone who critiqued them for being too arrogant.
Yeah. Oh, so the the arrogance quote from Glenn Conrad so that's he's basically talking. I think this is that was written in like published in 91, 92, somewhere in there. And so basically like he's talking about Glenn Conrad was, I said, director of the Center for Louisiana Studies. And so he's circulating widely. He's, kind of writing a book. He's originally from New Iberia, I think. And he's just engaging with Cajuns, right? He's at the university and engaging with Cajuns, and he's commenting on this sense that, wow, like they elected Edwards as governor, and they got Codeville, and they think they're the kings of the world now. They own the place, and you really, it's very polemical. If you go and read that passage, it's very polemical. It's even more polemical than the excerpt that I put in the book. And that's consistent with the way that Conrad was for years, in my opinion. Yeah, that comment about Cajuns and their arrogance is from the late 20th century, and he basically said, all these stories that Cajuns are telling about how, oh, so and so, these Anglos down the Tesh stole my grandpa's land, right? He's basically saying those are all exaggerations, and those, grandma's, memories, and they're all wrong, right? And historians need to come in and correct that, right? So that's what that comment about arrogance from Conrad is referring to.
Got it. Our next question says, lived memory and constructed memory are two ways scholars describe how we remember the past. The key difference is whether the memory comes directly from personal experience or is shaped afterward by interpretation, narrative, and external influences. If there is no lived memory, as you said at the beginning of the presentation, how much existential value do you grant to lived memory, such as the interpretation made by Morgan Richard pointing to the mural?
Yeah, so um, I mean, you're right. If I mean, there are plenty of historic sites that we roll into, and we just take away, I don't know, some information, right? So it's it is the case that like it's not every site that is going to be creating, as I claim here, that's going to be creating historical memories for people, right? Um, but yeah, there's something about the deep emotional engagement that people brought to the memorial, right? The Cajuns brought to the memorial, and the way that it activated, right, like their own lived experience, memories of their own lived experience, and that they so actively, creatively, expansively connected to the narrative of the site that makes me want to say that um, yeah, there's something like a historical memory being created here, right? Like they're experiencing the through their engagement with the memorial, they're coming to experience to have an experience a connection. Let's put it that way. They're coming to have a connection to the deep Acadian past, the deep Cajun past that they did not have before they rolled into the venue, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm taking a little uh, a liberty by calling it the creation of historical memory, but I think you read an excerpt like that piece from Morgan Richard, and I think there's some justification for it, right? People are really they're activating their own memories, and they're connecting to the story and claiming it as their own, right? And so there's some, it's more than just information what they're taking away from the site. It's something, it's an understanding of the past that that's deeply meaningful to them, right? And that's what makes for memory. It's information that is affectively meaningful, that's connected, right, to person, right? And so that's why I want to talk about what's going on at the memorial as something of the creation of historical memories.
Great. To go off of that a little bit, so like as a historic site, and you mentioned auto history, which like interweaves people's own memories into the site's narrative. Do you think that there are other places that have that same sort of feeling for people that visit? And if so, do you think it is tied because of the traumatic past of the people that are kind of being faced with their own trauma there?
I mean, one thing I would say, that's a great question. Um, uh, One thing I would say is that, it's not everywhere. Like St. Martinville is kind of a unique place. It's not everywhere. You could do an ethnographic project, I don't know, say in Eunice, say, where there's a Jean Lafitte site, and you might not find the same things that I found in St. Martinville, right? In terms of like engagement with the historic site, right? Um, but Well, so a couple more things. One is that it's clear to me this doesn't happen everywhere, right? It's not everywhere that people like feel so personally engaged with the history that they're consuming in a historic site. Um, and but I do think so. Here's the first piece. I do think that like many practitioners are bringing um, a vision and a goal and techniques to designing sites and curating them where they absolutely do want to have deep impact on visitors, right? That's where that piece by Freeman Tillman comes in, right? Um, um, there is a deep commitment to conveying historical truths in ways that will really engage people, right? In deeply meaningful ways, in all sites, in lots of sites. The other thing I would say that's specific about this this particular case is that, yeah, without like that's one of the key findings. The creation of those historical memories at the memorial is so dependent on all of those memory tattoos, I call them, that those Cajuns brought to the site, right? All of those experiences of marginalization, of disrespect, right, of hardship, like Morgan Richard recounts, right? That is like essential fodder for an emotional and visceral engagement with the history on offer, right? So that there may be something unique to what's going on, what happened at the memorial compared to other sites in that regard.
Thank you. Our next question. So someone writes, I'm wondering how much of historic site development around Cajun history reflected the tendency to racialize Cajuns as white and Creoles as black, even though there was quite a bit of overlap by the 1970s. You mentioned a perceived proximity to blackness that helped to perceive Cajuns as non-white, so it seems that the ethnic binary might have been convenient to public memory. Any thoughts on that?
So, one thing I didn't talk about was um, basically kind of what was going on in St. Martinville, and there's a whole chapter on this. What was going on in St. Martinville at the time, socially, racially, for example, and uh, one of the things that I talk about there in that chapter is how um, St. Martinville, like post segregation, has been really tough in that town. Um, I was actually there at the end of an entire, there was a whole decade where there were not city council elections in um, in St. Martinville, and it was because of a kind of a conflict over redistricting that that turned on race. It was going to be the kind of the racial composition of each of the districts. Um, St. Martinville is also a place where St. Martin Parish is also a place where um, uh, a school desegregation case that was opened in the 70s was not resolved until 2021, right? So it's kind of place where race relations are definitely fraught. Um, it just so happened that when I was there, uh, they were finishing the edition exhibit of the exhibit, the historical exhibit connected to the memorial, at the same time that they were building um, an African American museum, a historical exhibit. And so it was very interesting to me. It allowed me to do like this, you know, in a small town setting, kind of a comparison, like what shows up in these two sites, right? And one of the things that was very clear is that without any problem, the Cajun site could talk about um, le grand dérangement, right, and the tragedy that it entailed, and the suffering of Cajuns, right? As well as kind of more recent stuff. That the history of being second class citizens, second class whites in early 20th century Louisiana. All that stuff could be just talked about openly, easily. In the black site, they could not talk about. So, for example, they did not talk about black suffering. So, for example, there were black locals, residents, citizens on a commission who wanted to feature some shackles in the African American Museum, and the white participants in that project were like, "No way," right? Um, so so like that's just to say a little bit about why I think that uh, historical victimhood has played out differently for Cajuns as whites versus how it's played out for blacks, right? Um, One other thing, and I just mentioned this in passing, but this is really, I mean, this is kind of important. Um, I think there are plenty of people. I mean, it's much more common that folks who identify as Creoles uh, uh, of color um, are descended from kind of French colonists, right? There's some kind of French ancestry in their history. Um, in the Teche Valley, there's plenty of Cajuns who also there are plenty of Cajuns. There are Broussards that are white and black. There are Martins uh, um, that are white and black, right? And on and on. And there were folks in St. Martinville who wanted to roll into the Acadian Memorial and claim folks, mixed race folks, who wanted to roll into the memorial and claim that history as their own too. But they were not by and large welcome, right? Um, so there was a real, I mean, you know, not I've already gone on too long, but I'll put it this way: there's something of a retracing of the color line in this new history, right? Um, yeah, like acknowledging the kind of the history of miscegenation, which is very, I think, very prominent part of like the sugar belt in South Louisiana, right? It's still something that hasn't happened.
Thank you. Next question. So, I noticed when you were talking about the otherization that that Cajuns were not quite white, and then later on they sort of were othered as like the good minority. So is there what do you think of that phenomenon, and do you see that happen in other groups? Off the top of my head, there's kind of that similarity between like Irish immigrants, I feel. Um, can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like clearly, like, yeah, there's there's a lot of, former white ethnic uh, minorities have been, who've been whitened over the years. This you might think of this as kind of another example alongside Irish and Italians, and we could go on. Um, and there's plenty, there's scholarly literature out there about how Jews became white, right? How Irish became white. Um, and so this is in some ways I'm adding to that literature. Um, I mean, there's one of the books I relied on kind of talks about, it's called Roots by Matthew Fry Jacobson, and talks a little bit about kind of the white ethnic revival in the 60s and 70s. And talks about how, I mean, he goes into great detail about kind of its historical, why it happened. Part of it was like a backlash, a little bit of a backlash against kind of civil rights movement. um, there's other things, there's certain nostalgia in play, according to Jacobson. um, you know, this case, um, has pieces of that, um, but connects, overlaps with that story, with the story that Jacobson tells, and it's very much a story centered in the Northeast. But there's something. I mean, first of all, it's happening. I mean, a lot of that history of how other white ethnic groups became more white. A lot of that focuses on what's happening in economics and labor, right? And kind of like those groups' participation in, um, different sectors of the economy, and how that's their upward mobility is facilitated by, their participation and their rise into the middle class, that kind of thing. Um, my story is slightly different because I'm looking at it through the public sector, right? Through public history, right? But I think it's because it's so prominent, because there are all these sites. I mean, there's really nowhere else in the country that, like, that has, where there's a national park site, a national park, like Jean Lafitte, that has so much history devoted to a white ethnic group like the Cajuns, right? And so I take that as kind of my jumping off point. Like, there's something different and special about, or special, put that in quotation marks, something intriguing, right? Unique about, uh, how this really expansive, use of public history to talk about a particular group, right? There's something interesting about how that is the vehicle for whitening, if you will.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for one or two more questions, and one participant is wondering what role Cajun Catholicism had in this public history slash memory.
So, so in terms of practitioners, I would say, um, um, like the Park Service, the Freeman Tildens of the world, religion is not kind of a central part of the mix in their practice of public history. But certainly, down in St. Martinville, um, plenty of visitors, and I mentioned this a little bit in the book. Plenty of visitors are really kind of interpreting what they're seeing with their kind of Cajun Catholic lens on. Like, so that came up a lot in those visitor reception interviews. Like, they're definitely, you know one of the through lines, and the site itself doesn't necessarily foreground it, but they're seeing one of the through lines is the commitment and the faithfulness to Catholicism, right? That came through in interviews. People talk about that. Um, After the site opened, um, one of the um, I think she was chair of the board, um, Christy Mare. There's a if any of you've been up to Nova Scotia, to the site, up in Grand Pre, where there's a cross that marks the spot where, those folks in that area were deported from, right? The deportation cross, I think they call it. It's a large iron cross. Um, at one point, so the board leadership at the site on the practitioner side were like, we got to have a double like that down here, right? To kind of, because that's going to more fully express, right, the story and the religious aspect of what we think is important about our past. And so there's now an exact replica, apparently, of the deportation cross in Nova Scotia. There's an exact replica in the courtyard of the Acadian Memorial, right? So yeah, that shows up as a dimension of how people are thinking about and connecting to the Cajun past.
Thank you. I think we have one more time for one more question. And for me, what made you want to write about this topic? What made you your topic interest of research?
Holy crap, what a question to end on here. Um, I well, I'm from, I mean, maybe the like that second slide probably gave the game away. I'm from Louisiana, born and raised there. My people have been there for centuries. I'm descended almost all of my family tree is Acadians. And so whatever, I have kind of that kind of interest. Just like yeah, wanted to do research in Louisiana. But another piece is, and I basically kind of said this. I had a sense, or kind of referred to it in the presentation, when I was starting to looking for a research project. Um, I had a sense that something really intriguing was happening at the memorial, right? People I knew and respected were connected to it and talking about their experience. And I was kind of fascinated. I had a sense of this, wow, there's been a reversal. Things didn't used to be this way. And very quickly now, right, we've gone from not quite white to model white ethnic minority, right? And the historical narrative seems to be important here. It's an interesting piece. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, I had a sense that something intriguing, yeah, just emotionally, experientially was going on with folks at the site, and I wanted to understand it. I was curious. I wanted to talk to them and see what it was about.
Well, thank you for that. We're very thankful that you were interested as well, because this has been a fascinating presentation. And I think that will wrap us up. Thank you again to Marc, our speaker, and thank you to all of you for being here. A reminder that Remembering the Cajun Past is out now through the University of Massachusetts Press. Next month's second Thursday lecture will be held on February 19th, which is actually the third Thursday because of Mardi Gras. Muses Thursday, a lot of us are going to be at those parades. And so that lecture will focus on Death or Victory, the Louisiana Native Guards, and the Black military significance in the Civil War by A.J. Cate. And if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, please keep an eye out on our website calendar for upcoming events. And if you like what you see, consider becoming a member. Thank you all again, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Marc.
Thank you so much.